The news day continues here on One News Now Business. I'm Marisol Halili. Here are the biggest stories on the economic and corporate fronts. The House of Representatives has begun its deliberation on the proposed 5.768 trillion peso national budget for 2024. Among those present are the country's economic managers from the Finance Department, DBM, and NEDA. The economic managers are currently briefing House members on their proposal. The proposed budget is 9.5% higher than this year's allocation of 5.268 trillion pesos. President Bongbong Marcos raises concerns about the country's debt-to-GDP ratio. Marcos Jr. says the 63% figure is a little high for the country and not ideal. This is above the 60% threshold considered manageable by multilateral lenders for developing economies. The chief executive deemed it worrying, even though he says the Philippines is, quote, doing better than its neighbors. Given this, the president says the government is now looking at improving the country's growth numbers to reduce the ratio. Marcos Jr. also says they are working to find a balance between tempering inflation and the effect of elevated interest rates.
So it stands, it's about 63%. And that's a little high for us. It is not ideal. We are working very hard to continue with that growth trend. We are, however, beset by the problems of inflation. And that is why the monetary policy has been quite robust and increasing. But then we worry about the constriction of the economy by very high interest rates. And so this is something that we have to balance.
The country's gross domestic product, or GDP, posted a slower 4.3% growth in the second quarter of 2023. This is much slower than first quarter's 6.4% and even weaker than the 7.5% locked in the same period last year. The figure is also way below the forecasted 6% median estimate by analysts in a recent poll by Business World. The weaker growth is attributed to factors like inflation, the lag effects of interest rate hikes, the slowdown in government spending, and the absence of election-related spending. So far, the Philippines' average GDP growth in the first half stands at 5.3%, lower than the government's full-year target of 6 to 7%. NEDA Secretary Arsenio Balisacan, though, is still optimistic that this target is achievable. To do this, the GDP will have to grow to at least 6.6% in the second half of 2023.
We recognize that we shall continue to confront a challenging economic environment in 2023 and 2024. The economic team is closely monitoring domestic and external developments and is ready to make policy adjustments to ensure that we attain our medium-term growth targets. We firmly believe that the prospects of the Philippine economy remain strong and positive.
Here to give us his insights on the latest GDP figures, we have with us on the show ING Bank Senior Economist Nikki Mapa. Good morning, sir.
Good morning, Maricel, and thank you for having me.
Thank you for joining us this morning. Sir, 4.3% from 6.4%, it's a huge drop in terms of our GDP rate. Malayo rin ito dun sa expectations natin, which is around 6%. Ano po? So where can we attribute this? Of course, ang economic manager, sinabi nila na there's the spending and the inflation. But what do you think is the reason? Bakit ang laki ng drop?
Yeah, well, Maricel, thank you. We agree with most of the reasons na binigay po ng economic managers. We were actually one of the more pessimistic, or we gave one of the lower forecasts for growth, but the actual figure was even lower than that. We were flagging, or we had some concerns about slowing momentum for the economy. Yung tawag natin last year, yung revenge spending na naganap with the economy reopening. We saw a lot of household spending, a lot because of finally getting out of lockdown. This year, that has started to slow, and I think that's one of the reasons kung bakit mas mababa yung second quarter GDP. Pangalawa, nabanggit po rin po nila na yung loss of election-related spending. This is what we call the base effect. So last year, maraming gastos, a lot of economic activity happening related to the elections. This year, wala na pong election, so that usually also fades very quickly. Third, yung underspending ng government, nabanggit din po ng ating secretary. Also, maybe as the new administration comes into to work, they are still learning the ropes. Baka naman hindi lang sila sanay sa proseso, so this might take some learning to do. But eventually, hopefully, as they learn how things go, they can improve spending towards the second half of the year. Also, I think nabanggit ni Secretary Bala sa akin yung tawag nila lag impact ng interest rate hikes. So the BSP hiked interest rates very aggressively last year. Yung epekto po nun usually takes about 9 to 12 months to take effect, and we are starting to see that now. Yung impact po niya sa capital formation or sa investments, kita-kita na po in the second quarter of this year.
Pero sir, nabanggit po nga po ninyo yung revenge travel at saka yung election spending. In a way, it's also expected na bababa siya this year considering na last year talaga naman election season. So we expect the increase in spending. So is this a cause of concern considering na some of the reasons are already expected?
Well, yung revenge travel actually is still alive and kicking. The numbers show na malakas pa ang travel. Although we are seeing a strong influx naman ng mga foreign travelers, so may pang-offset naman yan. We're starting to see more foreign tourists come in. Siguro on the slower than expected growth, I think that's something that we have to be mindful of. In particular kasi government din yung one of the main reasons for the slowdown kasi contraction yung government spending. So yeah, I guess something that we can build on in the second half of the year. Government, I think, sinabi po ni Secretary Balisacan, they will try to double efforts to improve fiscal spending so that this can support economic growth the second half of the year. So yeah, hopefully fiscal stimulus, yung paggastos ng government can be at a much more pronounced pace sa second half para makasupport naman sa growth in the second half of the year.
And we've heard a statement of NEDA earlier saying that they are still optimistic that we can achieve the 6 to 7% growth rate target. So sa inyo, sir, do you think this is still achievable?
Well, never say never. It will be a good fighting target to still try to aspire for that 6 to 7% growth. However, maraming headwinds na tawag po nila. Inflation still quite high at now may mga signs na baka pataas uli yung mga presyo ng bilihin with the increases sa global market ng langis tsaka yung mga commodities like rice, very important sa Philippines yun. So I think against this backdrop, very challenging. Might be an uphill climb to get that 6 to 7% growth. However, I think one thing we also have to note here is that 4.3% or 5.3% for the first half of the year is nothing to sneeze at. In this landscape of slowing global growth and all the challenges that we face, I think it's still a very good number. We just have to keep on building on top of it.
And speaking of inflation, marami po tayong inflation headlines lately. Of course, yung pinaka-recent this Tuesday, 4 pesos increase sa diesel, hindi biro yun. And di natin alam kung masusundan pa. And of course, palay prices reaching a record high, manufacturers calling for price increases. What's your projection in terms of inflation? Gaano kalaki yung inaasahan natin na magiging impact nitong inflation rate when it comes to our economic growth for the second half?
Well, the good thing is that inflation has been coming down from the peak that we saw in the first month of the year ng 8.7. I guess the bad or the more challenging aspect is that now we're starting to see oil prices tsaka yung palay prices or rice prices sa global markets tumataas ulit because of factors out of our control. However, there are steps that we can take, I think, to mitigate these increases. One is to improve production onshore ng actual produce natin para we don't have to import so much rice. Secondly, if we really have to import rice, hopefully this can be done at timely intervals. As best capable, we can hopefully buy hindi yung at the time na sobrang naka-peak yung global rice prices. I think the president said yesterday that we still have a lot of rice buffer stock to last for the whole of this year. So I think at the very least, we still have some rice supply here, which should at least mitigate some of the impacts of higher rice prices on shore. So inflation is definitely, I guess, number one enemy in the Philippine economy because we rely so much on households spending, and high or fast inflation tends to dampen that. So yeah, the government, this is one of the many things that they can do. I think if they want to foster faster growth, on top of government spending, is that they also have to ensure that inflation is kept in check. And I think they have said they will double their efforts to do so.
Okay, so aside from inflation, sir, what else can the government do to boost the growth at this point? Of course, you have already enumerated the actions that the government can do to mitigate the inflation. But aside from those points, what else should the government do?
Yeah, so a lot of fiscal spending, I think, will go a long way to boost growth. So government spending and helping keeping inflation in check. That's on the fiscal side. On the monetary side, eventually, with if inflation does come down and there is space for the BSP to start cutting policy rates, maybe late this year or early next year, this will also give households some relief from the extremely high interest rates that we're seeing. One of the main reasons for the drag on growth in the second quarter was the contraction in household construction. So private construction was actually negative. I think largely because interest rates are so high, this tends to dampen investment outlays for households because interest rates are at extremely high levels. So maybe when there's space, the BSP can also consider cutting policy rates maybe towards the end of this year or early next year. But once again, only if the data allows it or if the BSP is afforded the space to do so.
Okay, sir, Monetary Board meeting next week. What are your expectations? Will there be rate adjustments given this slowdown?
Well, I think this will be a very important meeting for Governor Remalona. He's sort of trapped in a situation where growth is slowing, so that should give him some reason to cut policy rates. However, he also has to contend with inflation, and there are signs that inflation could be headed higher or some price pressures might be building. So he also has to manage that. So I guess the best compromise is for the BSP to keep policy rates unchanged next week as they try to balance out the risks to inflation as well as the risks to slowing growth. So expecting a pause from the BSP next week.
Debt-to-GDP ratio remains a concern. How can this be reduced, sir?
There are two ways to skin a cat. And I guess in this particular scenario, you can either grow GDP very fast, and this will lower the ratio. Unfortunately, we didn't have a very good performance in the second quarter, but I guess in the second half of this year, if we can prove that we can grow faster, that's one way to bring down this ratio. The other way is to, unfortunately, slow down on spending or to improve the deficit numbers. They can also do this, I think, by improving revenue collection. So even if they continue to spend to support growth, if revenue collection is very positive or it's very efficient, then this can lower the deficit numbers. So yeah, hopefully they lower this number because if it stays elevated, this would be, I guess, a red flag that might catch the attention of some ratings agencies.
All right. Thank you for joining us. ING Bank Senior Economist Nikki Mapa.
Thanks for having me. Have a good day.
We'll be back with more stories after the break. Keep it here on One News. You're still watching One News Now. I'm Maricel Halili. The country's agricultural output contracted in the second quarter due to a double-digit drop in fisheries production. Data from the PSA shows that the value of agricultural production declined by 1.3% to 427.69 billion pesos. The latest figure is worse than the 0.5% contraction logged in the same period last year. This was also a reversal of the 2.1% growth in the first quarter of the year. The 14.2% contraction of fisheries output contributed greatly to the overall decline. An agriculture group points to increases in fuel prices as a factor for the drop in fish production.
Basically, from my inquiry from our members, the fishery sector, it is because of the cost of fuel and also the cost of ice. No, so the municipal fishermen do not like to go out and catch the fish because mahal yung gasolina, mahal at mahal yung yelo, natutunaw yung yelo, so they cannot recover.
With lower farm outputs, rice prices continue to soar this month. But consumers may have to dig deeper into their pockets soon, as palay prices have climbed to a record high. In just a month, prices of imported rice increased by 7 pesos a kilo. This brings the total range to up to 45 to 65 pesos per kilo, from just around 40 to 58 per kilo last month. Local rice, meanwhile, jumped by 6 pesos, bringing the total to almost 55 pesos per kilo. Some rice millers warn, though, that these are still expected to increase in the coming months as prices of palay reach a record high of 39 pesos per a kilo.
Na nambentahan sa ganitong lean months, ngayon lang nangyari yung ganyang kataas. Ang pinagbabasihan ng pagtaas ng palit ng bigas natin dito sa Pilipinas, yung tinanggal ng gobyerno, yung buffer stock natin sa NFA. Kaysa ngayon, nagbabasi ang presyo ng bigas at palay natin sa imported. Napakataas ng imported ngayon. Kaya doon sumusunod.
With this, the Federation of Free Farmers warned that prices of rice could climb to 60 to 66 pesos. That's if the country fails to replenish its supply of the staple. Despite this, President Marcos, who also sits as Agriculture Secretary, assures that the country has enough buffer stock to last until next year despite the threat of El Nino. The agency, for its part, believes that these rice price projections are still speculative at this point.
Hindi dapat natin in-speculate yung mga ganyan na bagay kasi marami ang effect sa ating mga kababayan. So, but sa nakikita natin, sapat.
And those are the top business stories of the hour. I'm Maricel Halili. Join us again at 2 p.m. We are One News, all sides, all the time.